بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم الحمد لله نحمده ونستعينه ونستغفره ونعوذ بالله من شرور أنفسنا ومن سيئات أعمالنا من يهده الله فلا مضل له ومن يضلل فلا هادي له وأشهد أن لا إله إلا الله وحده لا شريك له وأشهد أن محمدا عبده ورسوله أما بعد فإن أحسن الكلام كلام الله وخير الهدى هدى محمد صلى الله عليه وسلم وإن شر الأمور محدثاتها وكل محدثة بدعة وكل بدعة ضلالة وكل ضلالة في النار. So today is lesson 9 in our series on the book Taqreeb Tadmuriyyah of Sheikh Ibn Uthaymeen rahimahullah. And in the previous lesson we more or less concluded the laying of the foundations, and Shaykh al-Islam Ibn Taymiyyah rahimahullah in the way that Sheikh Ibn Uthaymeen summarizes his writings. From that we can extract 7 or so principles or points which form the foundation, right? And so we mentioned those at the end of the last lesson. I'll mention them again just as a revision and reminder. So we said maybe the order is somewhat changed in this list, but first of all we said that we absolutely must combine between affirmation and negation in order to establish Tawheed. We cannot have Tawheed except when we combine between affirmation and negation. So we see that with respect to Allah's rububiyyah. Okay, there's no creator besides Allah, who independently creates. There's no provider besides Allah who independently provides, and so on and so forth, to all of the actions of creating, giving life, taking life, and guiding, misguiding, so on and so forth. Only Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is singled out with respect to that. Or whether it is in relation to his uluhiyyah, la ilaha illallah, there is none worthy of worship except Allah. Okay, so there is none worthy of worship except Allah, negation and affirmation. And similarly, when it comes to Allah's names and his attributes, there is none which is a likeness to Allah. There's none which is a likeness to Allah. There's none which is an equal to Allah, meaning in his essence, in his existence, in his names, in his attributes. So we absolutely must combine between negation and affirmation for there to be Tawheed. Without that, there cannot be Tawheed. We can't use negation on its own, nor can we use affirmation on its own. Point number 2 is that affirmation, we affirm for Allah whatever he affirmed for himself. So when we speak positively and mention attributes for Allah, then we affirm for Allah whatever he and his messenger affirmed for him. We use the same language. Thirdly, we negate from Allah whatever Allah negated from himself, and whatever the messenger negated from him. And in doing these 2 things, affirming and negating, we avoid 4 things. We avoid 4 things: ta'til, tahrif, tamthil, takif. And we mentioned what they were. Point number 4 was that affirmation is specific and detailed. We know this from the Quran and the Sunnah. Allah mentions his name specifically and in detail. He mentions his attributes specifically and in detail. He mentions his actions, right? These are specifically mentioned. That is the general principle, right? Affirmation specifically. And there are some exceptions to that, but that is the general rule. Likewise, negation. Point number 5, negation is general. Negation is general. So we negate in general terms, as exactly as we see in the Quran. لَيْسَ كَمِثْلِهِ شَيْءٍ هَلْ تَعْلَمُ لَهُ سَمِيًّا وَلَمْ يَكُنْ لَهُ كُفُوًا أَحَدٌ. And those verses that we mentioned previously. However, there are some exceptions to that, such as Allah negating a son from himself, and other things which we find, and that's because of a specific reason or a need to do so. But the general rule is negate in general. Point number 6, that in the Quran and the Sunnah there's nothing which is just a pure negation in itself. Anything that is negated from Allah, it always indicates is its perfect and complete opposite. The perfect and complete opposite. So if we negate if we negate deafness from Allah, it affirms His perfect, complete, all-inclusive hearing. And if we negate blindness from Allah, it indicates His perfect, complete seeing. And if we negate death from Allah, then it affirms His perfect and complete life, and so on and so forth. So there are no pure negations. There are no pure negations in and of themselves. And this is, as we said, it is unlike what we will find with the people of innovation. They just use pure negations without it affirming the opposite, without it affirming the opposite. And finally, the seventh point, and this was one of the crucial points, is that sharing in the name or the attribute, as in the word, as in the label, right? So Allah is hearing, man is hearing. Allah is seeing, man is seeing. Allah has life, man has life. Sharing in the name, the label, does not necessitate likeness in reality, right? And this was something that's proven by revelation, by reason, and also by just observation, right? 3 lines of evidence: wahi, revelation; aql, which is reason; and his, which is just a mere observation. So when we understand all of these principles that have been laid down so far in what has preceded, then the next stage now is that Shaykh al-Islam Ibn Taymiyyah rahimahullah, in the original book Tadmuriyyah, and Shaykh Ibn Uthaymeen summarizing and making everything simple and concise, he now proceeds to look at those who deviated in this issue of Allah's names and attributes. And the first or the section, fasl, chapter, في الزائغين عن سبيل الرسل وأتباعهم في أسماء الله وصفاته. He says, regarding those who deviated from the path of the messengers and their followers in the names of Allah and His attributes. And he says that they are الزائغون عن سبيل الرسل وأتباعهم في أسماء الله وصفاته قسمان, that they are of 2 types. They are ممثلة and معطلة. ممثلة and معطلة. What does that mean? ممثلة, those who liken Allah to His creation, and معطلة, those who negate from Allah what He is described with. 2 broad categories: mumathila, those who liken Allah in His names, attributes to the creation, and mu'attila, which means the negators, those who negate from Allah what He is described with. And the Shaykh says, وَكُلٌّ مِّنْهُمْ غَلَى فِي جَانِبٍ وَقَصَّرَ فِي جَانِبٍ. وَكُلٌّ مِّنْهُمْ غَلَى فِي جَانِبٍ وَقَصَّرَ فِي جَانِبٍ. Both of these 2 groups, they exaggerated on one side, on one aspect, and they fell short in another aspect. Right? So what is the nature of the mistake of these groups? They exaggerated one aspect and they fell short in another aspect. So he then goes on to say, فَالْمُمَثِّلَ, so they are those who liken Allah to His creation. غَلَوْا فِي جَانِبِ الْإِثْبَاتِ وَقَصَّرُوا فِي جَانِبِ النَّفِي. Right, so the people that we are going to discuss today, they are the mumathila. They liken Allah to His creation. What did they fall into? They exaggerated in the issue of affirmation, ithbat. And no doubt, ithbat, to affirm for Allah what He affirmed for Himself and what His messenger affirmed for Him, this is one of our principles. But these people, they exaggerated in that aspect. And they fell short in the aspect of negation. So they exaggerated in affirming the attributes of Allah above and beyond the bounds, and then they fell short in negating any likeness. Right? They fell short in negating likeness from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And as for the mu'attila, غَلَوْا فِي جَانِبِ النَّفِي وَقَصَّرُوا فِي جَانِبِ الْإِثْبَاتِ. The other way around. The Mu'attila, who are the negators, whom we shall discuss in future lessons inshallah, they exaggerated in negation, in negating from Allah, negating likenesses from Allah, and they fell short in the angle of affirming for Allah. Right, so as you can see, these groups, whereas we strike a balance between al-ithbat wal-nafi, affirmation and negation, and we stay within the limits of the Quran and the Sunnah, then these people have, disturbed that balance. And so they've exaggerated in one thing and fallen short in another thing. This is like the scales of a balance. It's like the scales of a balance. If you make one side of the balance heavier, then the other side is going to be lighter. So if you exaggerate in ithbat, then you are going to fall short in nafi, in negating a likeness. And if you exaggerate in nafi, in negating, then you are going to fall short in ithbat. And this is what happens when you exit the limits and the boundaries of the Quran and the Sunnah. So the Shaykh says, فَخَرَجَ كُلٌّ مِّنْهُمْ عَنِ الْإِعْتِدَالِ فِي الْجَانِبَيْنِ. So each of these groups, they swerved away, they deviated away from i'tidal, which is balance, and they went to either or to one or the two sides. Right? So this is a basic introduction to those who deviated. They fall into two categories: the mumathila here, and the mu'attila. And the mu'attila, they fall into four groups that we're going to look at inshallah in future lessons. In today's lesson, we are going to focus specifically on the mumathila, and to see what type of mistake, how they deviated, how they swerved, and how they violate these principles that we have established in previous lessons. So the first of these two categories then, فَالْقِسْمُ الْأَوَّلِ الْمُمَثِّلَةِ, the first category, they are the mumathila, those who liken Allah to His creation. They say, or here the Shaykh says, وَطَرِيقَتُهُمْ أَنَّهُمْ أَثْبَتُوا لِلَّهِ الصِّفَاتِ عَلَى وجه يماثل صفات المخلوقين، فقالوا لله وجه ويدان وعينان كوجوهنا وأيدينا وأعيننا ونحو ذلك. What do they say? The Shaykh says their path is that they affirm for Allah attributes in a way that likens, that is a likeness to the attributes of the creation. So they said Allah has a face, Allah has two hands, Allah has two eyes, and they are like our faces and our hands and our eyes, and what is similar, what is similar to that. And commenting upon this, Shaykh Ibn Uthaymeen rahimahullah, he says that these people, when we're going to discuss these people, the mumathila, we find that in comparison to the mu'attila, these historically and today as well, they have always been in the minority, right? So meaning that this deviation that we are speaking of here, the mumathila, those who liken Allah to His creation, this was neither historically nor through the ages nor now. It was never the huge, massive deviation followed by millions and millions and millions of people. No, it was something, as the Shaykh says, وَهُمْ قَلِيلُونَ فِي الْوَاقِعِ بِالنِّسْبَةِ لِلْأُمَّةِ الْإِسْلَامِيَّةِ. They are very, very small. They are small in number in relation to the Islamic nation. And the Shaykh says this is because this type of speech is not possible for it to really settle, right? Because most people know the futility and the falsehood of this type of speech. And as the Shaykh says, فَلَا يُمْكِنْ لِأَيِّ إِنسَانٍ عِنْدَهُ أَدْنَى عَقْلٍ أَنْ يَقُولْ عَيْنُ اللَّهِ كَأَعْيُنِنَا وَوَجْهُ اللَّهِ كَوُجُوهِنَا وَمَا أَشْبَهَ ذَلِكَ. Shaykh says it's not possible for any man with even the slightest amount of intellect, or the slightest amount of aql, to say that the face of Allah is like our faces, the eye of Allah is like our eyes, and what is similar. But there are some people, and there were some people historically, who actually said this, right? And this was among the Rafida, the Shia, right? In the 2nd century after Islam, there was those amongst them who said that Allah's face is like our face, and Allah's face is like the face of the most beautiful man, right? And they would say that Allah has the appearance as the most beautiful amongst the Bani Adam, and some of them would even affirm for him that he had flesh and hair and things like that, from the extreme of these people, from the Rafida, from the Shia, and this is what they spoke with. And so there was historically people who actually said this. So the moment you start speaking with this type of speech and you liken Allah to the creation, what have you done? Then you have made tanqis, you have belittled Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and you have made him to be like the defective creatures. And so this is belittlement of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So the Shaykh goes on to explain the reason why they said this, right? What's the reason? What's the shubha? What's the argument that led them to speak with the likes of this speech? And the Shaykh says, وَشُبْحَتُهُمْ فِي ذَلِكَ أَنَّ اللَّهَ تَعَالَى خاطبنا في القرآن بما نفهم ونعقل قالوا ونحن لا نفهم ولا نعقل إلا ما كان مشاهدا فإذا خاطبنا عن الغائب بشيء وجب حمله على المعلوم في الشاهد. So what is the basic thing that led them to make the likes of this speech? They basically said, the Shaykh says, that their argument or their doubt or their misconception in this affair is that Allah the Exalted in the Quran, when He speaks to us, then He speaks to us with things that we understand and that we grasp, right? So meaning the language of the Quran, when Allah speaks to us with the things that He speaks to us with, it's in a language that we obviously understand and we grasp. And we can only understand and grasp what Allah says by way of what we see around us, right? So what we see around us of what Allah has created, then we can only understand what is in the Quran by way of what we see and what we observe. And so when Allah speaks to us about the unseen, then it is necessary for us to carry it upon what we see and observe, which is from the seen. In other words, what they mean by this is, for example, we have milk, we have water, we have trees, we have, we look at each other, right? We have bodies, we have hands, we have eyes. And so when Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, because the Quran is revealed for us to understand and to grasp things, and so when Allah mentions in the Quran that certain things, whether in paradise like water and honey and milk and trees, and when Allah speaks of Himself with attributes, right, with certain attributes like life and hearing and seeing and faith and so on and so forth, because we are supposed to understand the Quran, because it's for understanding, then the only way we can understand that is by carrying it upon what we see around us in the creation, because then there's no way for us to understand what Allah means, right? And so this is the basic shubha, the misconception and the doubt. So the Shaykh goes on to say, after he mentioned previously that the people who actually came out with this, they are the Rafida, they are the Shia, and even the Shia historically, they only held on to this belief for a short period of time, right? Because the Rafida or the Shia who were upon this view in the 2nd century after Hijrah, right, they later became affected by the creed of the Mu'tazila. The creed of the Mu'tazila. And the Mu'tazila are from the other group, the Mu'attila. They are the ones who negate Allah's attributes. Right? So this group that we are speaking of, the Rafidah, they then went into i'tizal, right, which is the way of the Mu'tazila. And so they abandoned the tamthil and the tashbih and the tajsim, and they adopted the way of the Mu'tazila. And the Mu'tazila we're going to look at inshallah in later lessons. But the point being that this belief which appeared by a small fraction of people compared to the vast majority of the Muslim Ummah, and even then it was kind of short-lived amongst the Rafidah. But maybe after that there are individuals and parties and factions who, still fell into some of this exaggeration. Anyhow, this shubha, this misconception, the Shaykh says, this shubha, hum yarawnaha hujjah. Right? So this argument that I've just explained to you, they think this is a hujjah, but it's not a hujjah. Rather, we say this is a shubha. Right? A shubha is a misconception. There's a difference between an argument and a proof, which is a hujjah, and between a misconception. We have to make a distinction between these two things. Not everything which is presented to you in an argument is actually a hujjah. There's a difference between a hujjah and a shubha. And this is something that even we would experience day to day in our discussions, in our arguments, that someone comes along with something and we think it to be an argument, a hujjah, or a proof, but it's not actually a hujjah, it's just merely a misconception. And what's the difference between the two? Al-hujjah ma qama bihi al-shay. Ma qama bihi al-shay. Al-hujjah is that upon or by which something can be established, by which something is established. A hujjah actually establishes something. Right? It is built and found upon something. But a shubha la yaqumu bihi shay. Whereas a shubha isn't, nothing can be built upon it. Nothing can be built upon it. Right? It's not established, and nothing, it doesn't have a foundation, and nothing can be actually established by it. And so this shubha that they bring, this shubha is we call it a misconception. Why is it a misconception? Because it can't be established by the Quran. It's not established by the Quran, and it can't be established by reason either. Right? So it has nothing, there's nothing that renders this to be a proof or a hujjah, because there's nothing to actually back it up. So this is a shubha, not a hujjah. We must make this distinction between these two things. What is a misconception, a doubt, and what is an actual proof and an actual evidence. And this applies generally, not just to the issue of Allah's names and attributes, but in general, this applies to broadly to other things and other sciences and other types of knowledge as well. So the Shaykh says that this shubha that they rely upon, that that since Allah has spoken to us with what we are supposed to understand and grasp, and then when Allah mentions certain things, whether about what's in the unseen, paradise, hellfire, or whether that relates to Himself, His essence, His names and attributes, the only way we can grasp that is by making analogies through what we actually see and observe, right? And otherwise we would not be able to understand this. So the Shaykh goes on to explain that this argument, this doctrine, this way of thinking, this madhab, it is batil and mardud, it is false, and it is rejected bis-sam' wal-aql wal-hiss. Right? It is rejected by revelation, it is rejected by reason, and it is rejected by mere observation with hiss. Bil-aql, bis-sam' wal-aql wal-hiss. Right? So again, 3 lines of argument. We can show that this is false. So the first line of argument that the Shaykh brings, amma as-sam', as for revelation, then فَقَدْ قَالَ اللَّهُ تَعَالَى لَيْسَ كَمِثْلِهِ شَيْءٌ وَهُوَ السَّمِيعُ الْبَصِيرُ. Right, this is that verse that very important verse that we've been discussing in previous lessons. What did Allah say? لَيْسَ كَمِثْلِهِ شَيْءٌ. There is nothing which is a likeness unto him. So this now is an explicit refutation of tamthil. It's an explicit refutation of their argument, because they said what they are saying is the only way we can understand what Allah has mentioned in the Quran, that he has hearing, that he has seeing, that he has knowledge, that he has life, that he has irada, a wish, and that he has a face. The only way we can understand that is if we understand it in light of what we actually see, right? Of the hearing and the seeing and the face and the life of the creatures. But Allah has said, Laysa kamithlihi shay. There is no likeness. There is nothing which is a likeness unto him. Wa huwa as-sami'ul basir. But alongside that, he affirmed that he has hearing and seeing, meaning a hearing and seeing which cannot be likened to what we have. This is an explicit refutation. And the second statement, the second verse that the Shaykh brings is فَلَا تَضْرِبُوا لِلَّهِ الْأَمْثَالِ. فَلَا تَضْرِبُوا لِلَّهِ الْأَمْثَالِ. Do not make for Allah likenesses. Do not make for Allah likenesses. So the Shaykh says in the first verse, وَفِي الْآيَةِ الْأُولَى نَفِي أَنْ يَكُونَ لَهُ مُمَاثِلٌ مَعَ إِثْبَاتِ السَّمْعِ وَالْبَصَرِ لَهُ. In the first verse, Allah negated that he has anyone who is a likeness to him, whilst alongside that affirming hearing and seeing. وفي الثانية, in the second verse, نهى أن تضرب له الأمثال. He negated that likenesses should be made for him. فجمع في هاتين الآيتين بين النفي والنهي. So look at how in these two verses, in the first verse, Allah made a negation, nafi, laysa kamithlihi shay. And in the second verse, he made a prohibition, a nahi, a prohibition, right? Because in the first verse, he simply informed us, negating that he has any likeness. And in the second verse, he actually prohibited us. He prohibited us from making a likeness. فَلَا تَضْرِبُوا لِلَّهِ الْأَمْثَالِ. So Allah combined between both of these two things in the Quran. And so this is the first line of evidence. And also there could be other evidences as well. وَلِلَّهِ الْمَثَلُ الْأَعْلَى. وَلِلَّهِ الْمَثَلُ الْأَعْلَى. To Allah belongs the loftiest example, which means he is above the creation and what is with the creation. Right, so these are evidences. So this now is from the revelation, right? This is clear and explicit. To a mumathil, we say that you have opposed the statement of Allah, laysa kamithlihi shay, and you have opposed the command of Allah, فَلَا تَضْرِبُوا لَهُ الْأَمْثَالِ. Right? Do not فَلَا تَضْرِبُوا لِلَّهِ الْأَمْثَالِ. Do not make for Allah any likeness. Right? So this is disobedience to His command. The second argument, or the second line of evidence, is from reason, and there are numerous lines of evidence from reason to show why this is false. And so, in the first line of reason, the Shaykh says, وَأَمَّا الْأَقَلْ, as for reason, فَدَلَالَتُهُ عَلَى بُطْلَانِ التَّمْثِيلِ مِنْ وُجُوهٍ. There are numerous lines of evidence to show the falsehood of tamthil. The first one, al-awwal, التباين بين الخالق والمخلوق في الذات والوجود. وهذا يستلزم التباين في الصفات لأن صفة كل موصوف تليق به فالمعاني والأوصاف تتقيد وتتميز بحسب ما تضاف إليه. Right, so this line of argument, the Shaykh says, that the distinction between the created and the creator is because the existence, the wujud, and the that, the essence of the being, of the creator and the created are different, right? Right? So meaning that the existence of Allah, He exists, and His being, His essence, right? In both of these two things, the that and the wujud, Allah is completely different to His creation, right? And if that is so, then this necessitates that He's also different in His attributes. So do you understand the argument here, right? It's like if I said, it's like we know that in this creation, we know that things have essences, right? Water has an essence. There's an essence. There's a being that water has. And that being, the essence of how it is, determines or is how its attributes are, right? But different to that is this. This has an essence. This has a being and an essence and a reality to it. And that gives it, and how it is determines how it has its attributes. And similarly, humans and animals and life, right? We have a certain being, and our life is requires certain things, and that then determines our attributes, how our attributes are, right? So the way our attributes are in our bodies is different to the way the attributes are with water, that water has, which is different to the attributes of fire, for example, and the essence of the fire, right? Because these are all different essences and realities, and so the way the attributes are found in those things is based upon the reality of their essences. This is very clear, right? Because this is something that we know, we observe, we see. Now, because Allah Azza wa Jal, in His essence, in His being, which we have no knowledge of, it is impossible for us to know the reality of the being of Allah, the essence of Allah, the that of Allah, and also the actual existence of Allah, the wujud of Allah, right? His wujud is unlike our wujud. His existence is unlike our existence. And we know this because Allah Azza wa Jal, He is al-awwal wal-akhir. He is the one before whom there is none and the one after whom there is none. He has always existed, right? There was no absence in His existence. And these are unlike the creation. We were not there and then we came to be, right? So this is a clear difference in Allah's wujud and our wujud. We cannot be likened to Allah in His wujud because this is not true. So Allah is different and distinct in His wujud, and likewise in His that, in His essence, in His being. We've got no knowledge as to how Allah is in His being. So because He is different to His creation in His wujud and in His that, then this necessitates this, as the Shaykh says, he says, وَهَذَا يَسْتَلْزِمُ التَّبَايُنْ فِي الصِّفَاتِ. This necessitates difference in the actual attributes. And this is something very easy to understand. From reason, it's very, very easy to understand. If you look at the essence of this thing, this water, what its being is, it has certain properties and attributes that this doesn't have. It's very clear because the essence of this is different to the essence of that. And so how it has its attributes is different to how this has its attributes, right? This is very clear and apparent to understand through simple reason. If that is the case, as the Shaykh says, لأن صفة كل موصوف تليق به فالمعاني والأوصاف تتقيد وتتميز بحسب ما تضاف إليه. This is the same thing that we discussed in the previous lesson, right? When we said similarity in name does not mean likeness in the reality. So what the Shaykh is saying here is the attribute of everything is suited only to itself, and the meanings and descriptions, they are tied and restricted based upon what they are ascribed to, right? So to go back to our example of knowledge, we said the knowledge that a spider or an ant has is different to the knowledge that for example, a human has, which is different to the knowledge which an angel has. And how does an angel have knowledge and hold knowledge? How does a man have knowledge and hold knowledge? Right? This varies. This is different. And in each case, the knowledge is not the same. Right? The meaning of what knowledge is and what it means when we ascribe it to each thing, then it is unique. So when we say the knowledge of a worm, the knowledge of a spider, the knowledge of an ant, or the knowledge of an elephant, or the knowledge of a man, or the knowledge of an angel, or the knowledge of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, knowledge here, even though the word is the same, it takes on a different level of meaning and reality based upon what or who we ascribe it to. Right? So therefore there cannot be likeness. Just because we use the same name, there cannot be a likeness. Why? Because knowledge exists according to the being and the essence of the thing that we are speaking of. Right? Right? Even like I can hold this device and say, this phone here, there is knowledge in this phone. Right? But how does knowledge exist in this phone? Right? This is different, and it's totally different to when I say there is knowledge with a man. So this is very, very clear, very, very apparent. This is the first line of evidence from reason, right, to show why this argument is wrong. The second line of argument from reason still, this is still from aql. The second line of reasoning is that if you speak with likeness between the creator and the created, then, as the Shaykh says, أن القول بالمماثلة بين الخالق والمخلوق يستلزم نقص الخالق سبحانه لأنه تمثيل الكامل بالناقص يجعله ناقصا. So he says that if you speak with the resemblance between, or the likeness between the creator and the created, this necessitates deficiency, ascribing deficiency to the creator. Because likening that which is perfect and complete with that which is deficient makes him deficient. So the point being here is, if you liken Allah to his creatures, then you have reduced Allah to the level of his creatures. This is clear belittlement and ascribing deficiency to him and making him to be having a deficiency. And the Shaykh says, he gives us a number of examples to illustrate. If you have, for example, a man who is he is foolish and a bit dull and not so smart, and you have another person who is aqil, dhaki, right? He's intelligent, he's smart, and you say, this man here, this dumb man here is like this intelligent man here, then you have belittled the intelligent man, right? You've belittled him. And also another example the Shaykh mentioned, this is a line of well-known poetry, Alam tara anna sayf yanqus qadruhu idha qila inna sayf amda min al-asa. If you come and say that this sword is sharper than this rod or this staff, then you have belittled the sword. Because comparing the sword to a piece of wood or a rod or a staff is that you've belittled the status of the sword. Because you don't compare a sharp sword, you don't make comparison, a sharp sword with a piece of wood. Just like you don't make a comparison between a gun, a rifle, and one of those things, those catapult things that you hold in your the thing that you have in your hand, right? That you using elastic and fire. You can't compare between the two. You've belittled the gun or the firearm by making such a comparison. Right? So when you say that Allah is like His creatures, Allah's knowledge is like that of His creatures, Allah's hearing is like that of His creatures, Allah's seeing is like that of His creatures, Allah's face is like that of His creatures, you have now belittled Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Right? This is belittlement and ascribing deficiency to Him. Right? So this is the second line of reasoning to show how and why this is incorrect. The third line of reasoning that the Shaykh brings is أن القول بمماثلة الخالق للمخلوق يقتضي بطلان العبودية الحق لأنه لا يخضع عاقل لأحد ويظل له على وجه التعظيم المطلق إلا أن يكون أعلى منه. So this line of argument, the third line of argument, is that if you were to say that Allah is like His creatures in His attributes, then this necessitates it means that you are now falsifying the ubudiyyah of Allah. You are invalidating Allah's ubudiyyah, right? Him being worthy of worship. And this is because we know that a person only submits and humbles himself to another, by venerating and glorifying him absolutely. He does not do that except when he knows that that being is greater than him. Right? So we make ubudiyyah of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala because Allah is greater than us. We know that Allah is greater than us and He's greater than everything. So we worship Him or we make ta'zeem of Him. But if you are now going to say Allah is like you brought Allah to the level of His creatures in His names, in His attributes, then this also necessitates invalidation of ubudiyyah. Because now Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala in His names and attributes is equal to His creation, is like His creation. Where then is ubudiyyah? Where then is, how then do we make ubudiyyah of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala? And the Shaykh goes on to say, Shaykh Ibn Taymiyyah, he explains in the notes here that it's not possible for any man to humble himself to another unless he sees him greater than him and above himself. And the Shaykh goes on to mention like a linguistic point. He says even in the Arabic language, you see that the scholars of the Arabic language, they explain that when they explain the difference between al-amr, what is al-amr? Is a command. And the definition of a command is, it's something that's given from one to another, where the one giving the command is of a higher level than the other, right? Of a higher authority than the other. This is al-amr. But when the two are equal in status and level, this is not an amr. It is iltimas. It is like a request. Understand? Right? It's the difference between a command and a request. A request is where the two people are same level. A command is one from a high authority. Right? So the point the Shaykh is making is likewise if two are equal, then the notion of like obedience and ubudiyyah and it gets removed from the situation. So this third argument of reason to show how there cannot be any likeness between Allah and His creation is that it would invalidate the basis of worship, the basis of ubudiyyah to Allah, because now Allah is now equal and like his creatures, right? So these are three lines of evidence that the Shaykh brings, and what we can do here is, these are three lines of evidence for the second type of evidence, right? The first evidence was revelation. The verses in the Quran, لَيْسَ كَمِثْلِهِ شَيْءٍ وَلَا تَضْرِبُوا لِلَّهِ الْأَمْثَالِ. The second line of evidence is from reason. And there are three evidences from reason. The first one that we said, that Allah is different to His creatures in His essence, His dhat, and His wujud. And this necessitates that there has to be difference in His sifat as well. The second argument of reason is that it would entail ascribing deficiency to Allah. right? It would making ascribing naqs to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And the third one is that it would entail removing the foundation of ubudiyyah, of serving Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Why? Because now Allah is equal to the rest of his creatures. Right? So all of these are wrong. And then the third line of evidence, the third reasoning which we can finish with is al-hiss. Al-hiss. And he says, what is the argument? Just purely from observation. So he says, فَإِنَّا نُشَاهِدُ فِي الْمَخْلُوقَاتِ مَا تَشْتَرِكُ أَسْمَاؤُهُ أَوْ صِفَاتُهُ فِي اللَّفْظِ وَتَتَبَايَنُ فِي الْحَقِيقَةِ. He says, we look around us in the creatures, we see things share the same names, the same attributes in word, but the realities are different. فَالْفِيلِ فَلِلْفِيلِ جِسْمٌ وَقُوَّةٌ وَلِلْبَعُودَةِ جِسْمٌ وَقُوَّةٌ. Right? To an elephant, it has, a being, a body, and a power. And a fly has like a body and a power. But there is a difference. There is a difference between the two. There is a difference between their essences, their realities, and the powers that they have. All of this is known just by mere pure observation. Just by observing things, we see many, many things that share the same name, share the same attributes, but we know that the realities are different, right? And I can go back and give the same example. This water has an essence and a being. This wood has an essence and a being. And this water possesses quwwah, it has a strength different to the way that the wood has a strength. And in fact, the strength of the water can actually overwhelm and dominate the strength of the wood, because water can actually dissolve and eventually, rot and break down wood. Even though wood is physically harder and more strong in a different sense, in a different meaning. Right? So here we have an example of where even just taking quwwah, power, strength, two things, different essences, but the meanings are different and the realities are different as well. Okay? So because we observe and see these things around us, just mere observation tells us that when we speak of Allah's quwwah, Allah's power, and the quwwah of man or anything else, it is totally different. It's not the same, because Allah's essence is different, right? So this is something that we observe and is a clear evidence, a third line of evidence from just pure observation that Allah cannot be like His creation. Right? So this is the third line of evidence, and what we'll do is we'll finish with that for today's lesson, inshallah ta'ala, and we will conclude here. Walhamdulillahi Rabbil Alameen, wa sallallahu ala nabiyyina Muhammad wa ala alihi wa sahbihi ajma'een.